Hi, guys. Welcome back to the Sustainability Podcast, where we're bringing conversations on sustainable living. Today, I am lucky enough to host a good friend of mine called Winnie, and I will not overintroduce her. I'll let her get into it because I really don't know. I know what she does, like her title, but I've never. I don't know. Like we're learning together. I've never understood what exactly it is. It's a term. I learned how to use the word greenwashing, so she's going to explain to us what climate finance is today. So, karibueni.
Thank you. My name is Winnie Chepkemoi Mutai. I work as a climate finance specialist at the African Development Bank. And yeah, my basic day to day activity is to help countries mobilize resources to address climate change impacts and also drive solutions around climate change in Africa.
All right. Hi. At least I knew your title. So that's good. So maybe can you help us like understand what climate
Yeah.
finance is? We've been hearing that word literally everywhere the last, I think, 4 years in the space. So what is climate finance in a very simple language?
Well, climate finance, in a very simple way, is just resources that are geared or resources that are esteemed to address climate change. And so this could be and most of these resources are financial resources actually. So they could be in form of grant, loans, green bonds. They could also sometimes could take the form of blue bonds also now that we are having that kind of conversation. And so they normally, when you come to think about these financial resources, you think the sources, most of them could be private investments or private sector, could be governments, majority of them could be governments. And that's why you see, example, a country like Kenya, every county government has an allocation of their budgetary. You need to have 2% that should be termed as climate finance, or so 2% of your budget should be geared towards addressing climate change issues. You do have international development institutions and common institutions where we do have sort of what we call climate finance resources at the likes of African Development Bank, where I am. There is also the World Bank. There's the Green Climate Fund division and just the Green Climate Fund institution in itself. And then there is also the Global Environmental Facility and the Adaptation Fund. So these are the major 5 global funds where actually they were designed with the aim of providing resources to address climate change. And so when you also think about financial resources geared towards addressing climate change, they come in 2 sectors: adaptation and mitigation. And maybe as I go towards the conversation, I can define how we separate. But in a nutshell, that's the much about, and in a simpler way, about climate finance resources. Yeah.
Okay. You've used so many words that I need to help people. They said green bonds, blue bond. Maybe get into that a bit before we continue on to the 2 categories of adaptation and mitigation. So when you speak
Yes.
about a green bond,
So when you talk about green bonds and blue bonds, green bonds gear towards infrastructure, green infrastructure, and so they're sort of what you would call greening or building sustainable economies. And so when you're talking about building green jobs and building green skills, and so there's the component of also green bonds. And it's what we talk about green bonds, it's just basically in a nutshell, it's a form of financial instrument that is now strategically geared towards supporting building of green infrastructure, green energy, and those kind of components. When you talk about blue bonds, actually, there's a form of financial instrument that now it's coming up. It hasn't really picked up, but it's towards addressing climate change issues within countries that deal with water bodies or islands. And so we call them sometimes the small island states. What we grapple here with climate change, they're grappling it from a different perspective. So we are trying to offer sort of a form of financial instrument that could speak directly to countries that are grappling climate change, but from an ocean perspective, sea perspective, sort of water body mass perspective. So that's just in a nutshell. It's different from a grant and it's different from a loan in the sense that these ones are more, when you talk about a grant and a loan, you hear of these terms even in education, healthcare sector. And so climate change is beginning to come up with a financial instrument that could be pegged entirely on just addressing climate change issues. We are not yet there, I must say, especially in terms of Africa. We are developing what we are calling, I don't know if it's a good time to introduce, but green banks. And what you're calling green banks are sort of, we are designing sort of small financial institutions that are geared to where countries can go quickly and assess finances that are geared towards addressing climate change. And this is where actually SMEs can go directly to. So, sort of like from our institution, the bank, we are developing a green bank initiative. And so, with the hope that SMEs and then this, especially those that are geared towards young people. And so in my work, I have met many young people doing projects and innovations around tech and climate tech and that kind of thing. So these sort of green banks, as we call them, are supposed to offer financial resources to support innovations within climate change. And so that's why it had to be called green so that it could address. So these are just the various financial instruments that we could provide. We are providing on board now, not only us, but what global institutions are thinking about. And I know in a week time, leaders will be meeting at the New York Climate Week, and I have read through the agenda, and some of the key discussions are really actually about not only scaling up finance, but how do we ensure access to finance. So we might be busy designing green bonds, blue bonds, and whatever green banks, but how do we ensure its ease of access to people when they need it? That has always been the jargon and the complications that I see in my day-to-day work among countries. Yeah.
Okay. That's a lot of information.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot going on. I feel like it's a term that is has been used and no one is taking time to explain it to us. So thank you so much for bringing it down to the level where I think most of the audience now has a bit of a better understanding. So now let's now bring it back home. You've mentioned, at least for where you work at the bank, you're working between, like in business, it could be B2B, but now it's country. The money is coming out to the country. So how do you regulate that when you're giving, let's say, Kenya or Tanzania or any other country money that is for climate finance? What are you looking at? How do you verify, and then how do you monitor?
Yeah, it boils down to structures and systems we've put in place to state the reason why you need access to finance and what you will use to do that financing. And it comes with its own complications because now, so I'm going to give a simple example. I did host a conference. And so in this conference, there were representatives from various ministries. So there were 4 from African countries. And so these were from Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Finance. And the reason why anytime you begin to deal with the question of climate finance, there's always a question about what does Ministry of Environment know about handling financial issues? And then what does Ministry of Finance know about environmental issues? But here it is where financial resources are supposed to be managed well and effectively. And so we are at a point where we try and bring on board representatives both from the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment to sort of agree and endorse a project from a country level. And so that has been one of the structures and processes to ensure that whatever resources we offer have been implemented in accordance to the accountability structures and what was agreed upon. Second, basically, is just you develop sort of in a simple basis what people call a questionnaire guide. and it provide us with the activity, provide us with the reasons why this project is termed as a climate project. You need to provide us with the data. You need to provide us with indicators who are going to be the beneficiaries, what are going to be the impact of climate change. So you go through such a rigorous sort of I wouldn't call interview, but a questionnaire. And through that questionnaire, we are able to plug the information, and we do, of course, have an evaluation criteria to say, fine, this is a good climate project, and this is not a good climate project. However, the caveat I need to mention here, the whole climate change agenda became huge the past 3 years or four now. And so there is an evolving nature in how we manage climate projects different from development projects. And so people always ask, so how is climate project different from health education and these other projects different? And where we are at a point where we are trying to demystify the notion that government has, where you start looking at climate from climate is not development. Like there's development budget and then there's a climate budget. And we're trying to do away with that. And what we're trying to make governments understand is climate is part of development. And what you don't address in climate change in its indirect way affects your development in a huge way. And now it's becoming clear and clear and clear. So we are trying in a way to sort of enhance. One of the things that has come to my own understanding as I work now is there is a huge capacity knowledge we have to do, just not only within our work, but generally among government leaders and among people just who want to understand more about climate, but also the community itself. So we have a sort of surface number of people that actually understand what climate is, what needs to be done. And then there's a huge number of people that don't understand. And what happens between those two is a gap, and there's a lot of assumptions I see out there. And people are not quick to understand, and even you can tell quickly in the decision governments make. And so it's very interesting that climate now becomes an important budget allocation agenda dependent on who is the president and who is the government, who are the government leaders. So you all see almost that dynamics when you look across governments. And so then you begin to question, so do we just make it as an important agenda, or it depends on which government leader takes on? That depends, is this something that I can focus on and this is not? So we sort of need to make it look like it's a development agenda. It's not separate. It's actually, when you address climate, it's a plus to your development agenda. And so back to the question, I know it has evolved to how do we make it ease of access for them? It's the questionnaire guide. We ask questions. We do what we call appraisal missions. And what an appraisal mission, in a simple basic, is you go to affirm whatever was stated in the document is and will be implemented in the stated area. We got to affirm whether the number of beneficiaries that are going to benefit from the grant or loan that's going to be offered is actually an accurate figure. So there is sort of accountability measures that we do undertake before handing over any grant or loan. But maybe someone would say, it's because whether you work with World Bank or African Development Bank or the large institution, they have developed so far in the sense that they already have structures and processes. So what about the SMEs and the young institutions that don't have processes and structure? Who is to work with them to establish those structures, to ensure that how they use the money and how the impact that it's intended to bring is sort of achieved? So there is also that gap. Yeah.
Okay. You brought in something interesting about the SMEs, but before that, every single person you've had on this podcast has mentioned government as, of course, a key and major stakeholder. And there's words that were used, I'll not quote anyone, but there's around lack of implementation of policies. There's capacity needs, like you've mentioned here as well. So just from a professional perspective, what's the feasible way of dealing with this? Because I think I'm not like every single person who's been on this seat has really mentioned those issues. And it's a concern if we have government of the day, or not just here in Kenya, it happens quite a bit across, I think, the global south. But how do we resolve this? Do we need more stringent like measures coming from funders like Africa Development Bank and World Bank? Like, what's going wrong? Why are the governments not improving on how they're handling these resources, or even in supporting these communities in a sustainable way, or in a way that will actually bring change?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I the question about lack of government implementing what they intend to do didn't start with climate change. It started way before. It's sort of like a disease that grew and grew and grew, and now it's becoming more clearer and more in terms of how do we make government accountable. And maybe to shift that question that I always ask myself, who is government actually? Government is people actually. It's we need to go back and reframe the question and say, how do we make our elected leaders accountable,
Like that.
yeah, so that's how I look at it, in the sense of that. And having gone through a whole public policy sort of course, I began understanding that government processes and structures are not formed in a vacuum. It's people who sit and form the structures in itself. And so we begin attacking the word government without framing who we are attacking. Why don't we say the leaders? Why don't we name it that way? And so if you then begin to see government from a perspective of the human faces that run government, you begin to say, how do we shift the mental model of how public leaders think, how they understand development issues, Because I could as well wake up and run for elections. No one will judge whether I do really understand the intricacies of running a Ministry of Health. Being sort of grilled by Parliament in one session does not really affirm that you really understand the knowledge of running a ministry in itself. So for me, coming back to that would be one, sort of emphasizing on a systems thinking. And so when I mean a systems thinking is, how do you teach government leaders to look at a problem from a system perspective? And so don't look at it as a climate change problem. Look at it, if I don't solve this sort of impact or problem, what is going to be the ripple effect across health, across what we would call education sector? So how do we address climate change holistically? And so that for me has been always the thing. If we do that, if we take time and sort of create it as a curriculum in our education system, already halfway we've done the work of capacity building that is existing now, And then also, I mean, in a way, what we are trying to do, of course, with my work is, I mean, even next week I'm holding a workshop actually, and the core idea is always to meet this representative from ministries and finance and try to ask, what is it that you don't understand when you're trying to seek resources about finances to address climate change? And they'll mention to you the lack of technical capacity across ministry, the lack of support within government. They need someone
And now
to
it's being devolved, so
guide,
it's even now
and
at the
now
county.
it's
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah.
They will mention to you when you sit with them across the room. And when you look at it, majority, and what I've come to see over time as always, who will sit and teach us how to do climate finance? Who will sit and teach us how to mobilize these resources? Who will sit and guide, because you need sort of a continuous guidance to be able to become good at something. It's just evident. So there's the other challenge I do face from where I sit is the constant rotation of heads of ministries and heads of government. That throws us back a million times. So what happens when we've done a lot of progress in terms of engagement with a certain government, and then they shift the government leadership. So we go back to square one. The people who do really suffer in terms of not assessing grants, not assessing loans, and I do so. There's a project I'm handling which has been the most interesting kind of project since it was approved by the bank in terms, and the project was worth 10 million USD, which is huge. It's taken 4 years to be able to get the project going. And one of the reasons is the change of political situation in the country. So beneficiaries have missed to get an impact of this project. The changes in the system of government has affected this project in its entirety. So that tells a lot, but also the level of knowledge and understanding across the various shifts of government is also something to pay attention and to worry about. So I just think if we begin to emphasize on these systems thinking and the idea that we have to think through problems from a systems thinking and not just health alone or climate alone. That one would really help. The other one is actually just this more awareness sessions like this, would really, I think, be more helpful. Like a lot of podcasts, a lot of sort of interviews. If people, because it's the only way to disseminate quickly the knowledge and understanding to people and raise awareness. So this kind of also, but of course, I feel like the other one is, which has been also in my thought, is how to really educate schools and children about climate change. I just feel like the easier way to help the next generation is to teach them when they're in school now. It's easier than to sit and wait when they are out there in the world and we cannot be able to teach them about this whole climate change. It becomes harder. So the school system becomes easier than here. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I like the fact that taken it back to us, accountability of the citizens on, we can't keep saying the government, exactly who's the government really. It changes every other 5 years. Or now we've been seeing a very bad track record of it. Could be a year and you have a different minister for environment.
Yeah.
So again, back to holding ourselves accountable. The knowledge that you've shared is quite intense. Like I was saying, I've known you personally for a number of years and I've never taken time myself to fully understand the kind of work that you're doing. And I'm in almost a similar space. So I'm wondering how best do you see us taking this information? Yes, we have this podcast, but then there's someone's grandmother, there's someone's, like you were saying, there's a child in grade 1 with the new CBC system. How do you practically get this information down to them? How do we hold ourselves accountable to it? Just from what you've seen within your line of work. Even and then how do you finance this? Because again, you're in the finance space.
Yeah. I mean, financing is always the harder question. I think one of the things that struck me actually is I was just thinking the other day on my flight about who can design children's book in a way that's environmental, like in a way that can address, define to them what climate change is from a children's perspective. I don't know who can do that, but I guess there are many authors out there who can do such a work. It's the basic, most simplest and easiest way. Why don't we have sort of even cartoons or that are sort of speak kind of climate change words and terms, it's people underestimate that. But nonetheless, what practically we can do now, actually, I feel is how to just scale up this podcast to a wide variety of listeners. Such kind. It's hard to get a sustainability podcast. It's not easy, People consider it as jargon, a specialist world. But when you begin to listen to it, it makes 1 or 2 cents where we need to pay attention to it. So maybe the question could be, how do we draw more audience to listen to such kind of conversations? Because then the more they listen, the more they get transformed, and the easier they can pass it to other people. The other one is, I think for me is, and I find it so powerful, is using religious institution as an instrument. People don't, but I think when you come to think about it, 2 things sway people a lot: religion and money. So if you speak to many people about money, it's very easy for them to sort of listen to you quickly and align in one thought. When you speak to people about religion, it's very easy to find people in groups in religion. And then I found that the quite easiest way actually is to use religion institutions to pass this message of climate change and how better we could work with the religious institution to do this. They have sort of a way of speaking to the mass without even straining at all, you know? And that marvels me about the power of just religion and how quickly it can. Of course, the other one is education system. I will go back to that again. We are where we are because of the gap of knowledge. It always starts, a lot of things in life starts with a gap of knowledge and understanding. When you miss that gap of knowledge and understanding, it has implications. So basic simple idea, we if many people or many of us, we if we don't know how to manage finances well, it begins with a gap of knowledge. There's just a gap of knowledge that if because we didn't have growing up, then having to manage finances well was impacted by that. When you think about even the decisions people make on a daily basis, where to live, which transport system to use, what car to drive, is always informed by a knowledge. If I have knowledge, I do better. If I don't have the gap, how much I'm informed is how much will be shown in the decisions I make. And so I feel like I cannot really underestimate the power of knowledge. The more people are informed, the better choices we will make. Yeah.
So what I'm getting from this is contextualization of this information. Like if you need to go talk to the president, there's a language for him that he understands.
Simplifying it.
Then there's one for even talking to someone in the depth of, we had someone from talking about Masai Mara, in the depth of Masai Mara to understand what sustainability is, what climate change is, climate finance as well, and the opportunities. Okay, maybe the last thing I'd want to get into is on a SME level, you mentioned SMEs. So there's always been, I think I've been in a development space for a number of years. There's always that quota of about that 30%, 20%. Everyone is saying, I'm working with youth and women. But the amount of money they are being given to even implement some of these initiatives is one, very little, the minimal capacity. And then, like you've said, the big boys are the ones who get it at the end of the day. So even if it's funding that is coming to the bigger banks, and this could be a whole other topic about ethical lending and everything else, but the bigger banks are still getting a huge chunk of this climate finance when it's coming from outside. But the smaller circles, I'd say, are not having access to the same amount of money. Back again to women and how the banking system operates, even how they access that money for their own, fresh produce. If they're in fresh produce and they're trying to scale up their business, there's a huge gap in climate finance getting to the people who need it the most, particularly. And I know you had promised to get us into adaptation mitigation, but maybe just for SMEs, like what is a practical way of getting this money to them without putting, like you said, the checklist. Some of these checklists, like you said, is someone requires audited accounts from I don't know how many years back, and yet, it was with like my mother who had a small farm and then I've taken it over. We don't have those things, but there's something I could do that could create more employment, could bring more change. So how do we, that gap that is there, that exists between the bigger players and the smaller players in the SME world?
I'll go back to my point. I think the issue of access to finance by SME has always been there. It's just that there are certain development issues a country faces that allows and expands us to see sort of the many gaps that were not being seen. And of course, now when you speak about climate, I can tell you there are so many innovations about climate that young people are making. And a lot of SMEs, when you think about SMEs within the context of climate change, a lot of them are within either tech innovation. And I've actually, one of the interesting things I was seeing when I was looking at the New York Climate Week, one of the things you will see now, they have tech climate innovation, sort of a whole day to discuss about that. And I mean, I haven't delved much into that, but I'm looking forward to see the kind of conversations that go on in terms of climate tech nexus. It's something we don't know and we don't even never pay attention to. And so anyway, back to that, I know SMEs face a lot of challenge on access because there's no way the structure favors an SME. You know, the structures and processes when they're designed about assessing funds, there's no way there's always category. This is for SME structure and process. This is no. And even if you look at the large global funds that I mentioned, the five of them, they do not have, none of them has what we call a structured and process of ensuring that SMEs get climate finance in a specialized model. And that's why I was saying the African Development Bank then saw the need and said, we are developing and designing greenbacks, but we are still in the process of designing that. It's not also in the essence easy because you have to have a negotiated kind of conversations with private sector and the different players to sort of align, because we would need a pool of resources to establish this kind of bank. So it becomes harder, but it becomes harder because of the lack of accountability structures. But I mean, I do understand, because I would ask, why would I be busy establishing an accountability structure out of the vacuum when I do not have places to test whether the structures apply? I mean, the only way to test how I can manage $1 million is give me the $1 million. Then you can test and
see, yeah.
and see whether
Yeah,
I have
exactly.
the gap. And
Yeah.
you know, so sometimes I always sort of think about that way, as much as, because most people say, oh, SMEs don't have accountability and structure, but even when you think logistically, I mean, we are celebrating next year 60 years of the African Development Bank. And when I look at the preparation that has gone into preparing this, I'm like, it took 60 years to establish processes, run a whole system. And even now we do have some gaps. And so I'm just thinking to myself, why do we demand so much of an SME? And I think for me, the first way would be maybe supporting SMEs in terms of what would it look like to help an SME design structures and system? And these are climate SMEs. So how do we tune their structures and processes in a way that aligns and tunes itself to the climate processes and the climate structures that are required from these sort of global climate financial institutions like the Green Climate Fund, the World Bank? So who is there sort of, how do we create sort of that kind of nexus where even if we cannot offer them the kind of resources we can because of the demand that is required from their end, then how do we then create an enabling environment for them to, okay, lean and say, how can we be taught to establish structures and processes that will allow ease of financial resources? Because I mean, at the bare core of any SME, it's always money flow at the bare core. The reason why they designed this SME, apart from impact, I think the essence is how to ensure income, sort of, or an inflow of resources. And so that has been it. But also, I just feel like also the lack of the local sort of banks to be able to support them in terms of, because sometimes it's harder to assess the resource externally because there's no local bank that has started by supporting them, you know. So there needs to be this kind of conversation with local banks to say, fine. And I know ABSA has done that. ABSA has done phenomenally well when it comes to establishing support systems for SMEs. And they do it so well, but they also require a very sort of structures and systems in place. And so it's a really challenge to other banks to sort of scale. I know KCB has also done that through their Ajiri program. I don't know how far it is. I've not spoken to anyone who's benefited from that. But sometimes I always wonder, is the question about having a program to mentor SMEs, or the question about how can I as an SME, having gone through this program, assess the 1 billion? Is there an assurance? Sometimes I feel that's where most SMEs are disappointed, that I will go through this program, but I have to still go through a rigorous process of applying for a fund after having gone through this program, you know? So I don't know. I think it's It's a systemic conversation. It's not a wind fit. I don't know what's the best solution to it, but definitely, if we can't modify our processes to fit SMEs, then we need to have a conversation on how to guide them to establish the kind of system and structures that you require. And then, will this be a leverage for them to access the resources? This kind of open conversation, I guess it's something we need to sort of have, or dialogue,
Yeah, I think this is we're in the season of all the banks now are launching their sustainability
Yes.
reports from last year,
Yeah.
and I've had a look at some of them, and I think it's so disappointing to see the same things. They speak about the number of trees they've planted. Okay, we're planting trees, but then the real issues the salient issues you're talking about right now, like how far after training these SMEs, where are they now? How long have you held their hand apart from, going back and asking back for your money after, the same high interest rates? So I think I think for me, ethical lending is a very, my co-host Cindy has very strong opinions on tree planting. For me, on ethical lending, I'm always it riles me up so much because it's such a disservice. There's so much fatigue by SMEs because they keep going for these trainings. The fellowships are also extremely so many right now. So people are funding these fellowships, but these young people and these SMEs still don't have access to the resources, don't have access to like market linkages. There's a lot that is being left for them to figure it out still. And that's why that's where the money should be going to actually, opening markets, policies for on trade. There's a lot to, delve into it.
Yeah.
Okay. I know probably there's someone watching this and wondering, how did you get into this? Is this is there a course called climate finance, or is it something you bumped into, or are you just passionate about it?
Oh no, I'm laughing because I used to hate environment. In fact, I think God had exhausted all the options about work for me. And then he figured, let me exhaust and ensure you don't get a job until you land into climate finance or climate things, because then I need you to work in that space. So I actually didn't. I did my undergraduate in development studies, and then I thought, okay, maybe I could do economics of development. But one of the things that has always sparked my interest is development, how governments make policies, and what's the kind of decision making that comes around government. So that has been common for me ever since. And then, so what happened is I missed a job opportunity that I really wanted. And then the option was go do your master's. And then my master's sort of opened my mind. So I did pursue public policy. And I think that's when I began understanding how election governance, you get it wrong there, you get it wrong for the next few years. I started understanding what's the kind of economics that goes into making policies. People just don't wake up. There's a metrics, there's mathematics of finance that goes into making policy. And one of the concepts that I had to quickly learn is the cost of economies. And so what it basically means, you have to look as a country how your economy does, and then look at the versus the policies you've made and look at the implications. So sometimes you're busy saying this policy is not working, but it's not working because our economy, the way our economy is situated, that policy would do better if maybe we had a development, or we did increase sort of our per capita income, and sort of the policy that we have in place could work after we've done a development in a certain way. And so there's always those complexities. Anyway, I did that, and then I came back, and then I worked with the UN. And when I did that, I did governance, and then later I worked with an embassy at the embassy, and there I was dealing with multilateral affairs. But I was really structured in dealing with multilateral affairs from an environmental perspective. And that's when my mind began to open, and I began to say, oh, wow, so this is how multilateral environmental policies are made. This is how people lobby, how embassies that you see in Kenya really have an influence around many of sort of examples is the plastic policy. It didn't start in Kenya. I sat through the whole process to understand the kind of work embassies did and donors did to make that kind of policy, So then I joined the bank, and then I figured out, this would be my path. I don't know for how long, but so far so good.
Okay.
Yes, I didn't do climate change, but there are now courses on climate change. I know I've done one with Oxford, and that's on sustainable financing, but I think now they do also have on climate financing that people, so now there's also beginning to have a knowledge on climate. Basically, you won't get a climate finance course actually. You would ideally get an environmental course and then
As a basis, as a foundation. Yeah.
And I feel like people need to understand that climate at the core of it, because I get one funny question from accountants: how do I switch from being working in accounting to climate financing? And I'm like, oh wow, actually before I got here I had to have the basic foundations of environment, because it's not your normal accounting. It's not. There's an underlying knowledge of environmental issues I had to have on board for me to be able to understand how to utilize resources that are geared towards addressing climate change. So there has to be an underlying knowledge of environment. So I would say basically go to and do any environmental study course. That would really help you. And then from there, then you can decide, I want to switch and say, to climate finance. Some people do climate policies, which is also a very interesting field. I would choose actually that one also if I didn't do this. Or climate policy and governance is also a really interesting field. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, that comes to the end of this amazing conversation. I feel like we need to get you back. There are still so many questions at the back of my head. And just from the fact that we've hosted quite a number of people and financing kept coming up around, and also policy. So it would be great to have another round of conversations if you'd come back. But yeah, so thank you so much for your time.
Thank
We've
you.
come to the end. But I think if someone maybe wants to reach you, maybe LinkedIn would be the best approach.
I think LinkedIn would be the best.
Yeah, full name on LinkedIn, or you just
It's just Winnie Chepkemoi Mutai. If you Google that, I use my real name always.
We'll put it up on the description box. Thank you so much, Winnie.
Thank you.
All right, we've come to the end of this conversation. Thank you for joining us and enjoying this conversation on sustainability and the climate finance space. And we'll see you next time. Bye.